Hey guys, welcome back to the Designer Future podcast series. I've got a very special guest here today. Michael, go ahead and introduce yourself for me, man.
Hey guys, I'm Michael from the REDLINE Podcast, and I'm here to chat with Ollie today, which is absolutely awesome.
Wicked, cool. So this is actually the first time I've had like another podcast owner on. So just explain to everyone listening and watching what the podcast is around, how you sort of got into it, and what you do on like a day-to-day basis as well.
So the podcast for the REDLINE is designed to be this kind of deep dive podcast. So we do a big subject each fortnight with big experts from our group. So it's mostly geopolitics. So we've done the Libyan civil war and Russian Arctic expansion, the housing crisis in Australia, the war in Yemen, and we get three big experts on each week. And I'm talking like Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, MI6, the CIA, the White House, all these kind of guys that come on the show, to give their opinion. We're talking with the guys who actually make the decisions. So, yeah, this podcast started 5 months ago. We're already at 130,000 streams, which has been great so far. We're really happy. And it just started because I was writing for a lot of tabloids and newspapers and doing just war zone journalism for a long time. And then a guy approached me and was like, look, you should do a show. I went, yep, okay. And it kind of took off from there. So that's where I am now, just talking with all these experts and about the big subject shaping news.
Wicked, cool. So that's pretty sick, to be fair, man. So you mentioned you was actually working within sort of the niche beforehand, and someone actually approached you to start it.
Yeah, so I'd spent some time doing some like reporting and writing, ghostwriting for a lot of people, particularly mostly British MPs and House of Lords guys. Mostly like if they want to sound like they know what's going on in Moldova, they would hire someone like myself to come in and write a paper on them, so they put their name on it and say, I understand Moldova, here's my paper on it. So that's what I did for a while, and I was traveling to all these war zones. I'd been to like Kyrgyzstan and Iran and Belarus and Ukraine and traveled around, and they were like, look, we want someone who can, I've been in radio for years, and they're like, look, do you want to just jump on and be the host of this thing? You're the only one dumb enough to go to these war zones.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'd love to hear, while we're on that topic, a little bit, like a bit of a deeper dive into some of the places you visited, because that's pretty cool, man. I've never heard of anyone doing that for a job.
There's been a number of places. Iran is an incredibly beautiful country. I've been there. I've been to Russia quite a few times. I just got back from doing the Arctic, going up into Severomorsk and Murmansk. Way up there in the Arctic, which is where all the nuclear submarine bases are. We just got back from doing Transnistria, which is this breakaway Soviet republic, and that's the first time I've had to leave a country very quickly in the back of a car. We've done Uzbekistan, which was lovely. We ended up meeting some Taliban guys there and getting an interview with them and chatting with them. We've done some work in Turkey. Kyrgyzstan is still one of my favorite countries. Kazakhstan, the Kazakhs are the loveliest people you ever meet. Every time I go to Kazakhstan, my liver cries because they're just very, very friendly. But Kazakhstan was very nice. They're all very lovely. I've been to lots of, if there's a stan at the end or it sells cheap vodka, I'm usually probably somewhere around the place.
And have you ever felt like not scared, but have you ever felt like under pressure when you've been in any of these countries? Like you did feel like you wasn't secure at all?
That comes with it. I've had guns pointed at me a few times in these places. I know that Transnistria had to escape pretty quickly in the back of a car before their intelligence service was coming to get me. Mm-hmm. It comes with the job, but you don't get a good story. No exciting story starts with "I was in Belgium this one time."
Yeah.
But like again, most of these places are absolutely fine if you speak the local language. I speak some passable Russian, and that gets me through a lot of this. I give cigarettes out pretty freely as well, and that gets me through most things. Most people, wherever you go, are just generally nice people. They don't want to attack you. They don't want to hurt you. At worst, they're going to pull a gun to show their dominance, and then you can just go, look, buddy, what are you doing? I'm not here for that. Like, I'm here to have a drink. What are we doing here?
So with that being said, and, some of the countries that you've obviously visited within that job role, what's your sort of opinion on like the general media's concept on some of those places now?
This is actually what really boggled my mind. I grew up in a naval household myself, so kind of grew up with that Cold War mentality of the Russians are evil and they're coming to get you. And then I took a trip to Russia. I got very, very drunk with a very good friend of mine, and we booked this ticket to Moscow. So we ended up going, well, let's go. How bad can it be? And it was lovely. Moscow is much more beautiful than my hometown. And people are friendly and everyone's nice. And yeah, there's some weird stuff there, but generally people are lovely and open. And that's kind of opened my eyes to, generally everyone is exactly the same. You go to a bar in Moscow or a bar in Melbourne or a bar in New York, and everyone has jobs and families and mother-in-laws they don't like, and everyone's kind of the same wherever you go. The difference is the drinks get slightly cheaper and the more bullet holes in the wall there.
No, wicked, man. That sounds cool. It's such an interesting story, where you've come from. So what I'd like to know now is, obviously you've mentioned the podcast, which is great. From my perspective, I love people going that extra step. What sort of motivated you to go from, because it's not like some people where they have like your standard sort of 9 to 5 and they're like, yeah, I want to make a podcast because it's adding a bit of excitement to it. Right. So you've clearly had like a very exciting sort of job role that you was going to every day. What sort of motivated you? I know you said someone approached you, but what sort of went off in your head and thought, yeah, you know what, that sounds like a good idea to me?
Well, that's the thing. There's so many subjects that don't get covered and that actually crazily affect our lives. Like, we don't think about it, but how the Libyan civil war ends will decide European politics for the next 10 years. People don't really realize that. And it's a lot of subjects that, just don't really get covered. Because I went looking for a podcast exactly like this one, and the only one's kind of doing it with the BBC. And the BBC are great. I do have a lot of love for them, but you can tell they pull their punches. They do a lot of like, this is pretty bad, but we're not going to say anything further. Or you have other guys who are very beholden to like the New York Times. They won't say things about China, or they won't say things about particular countries. Mm-hmm. So I kind of wanted to do this show. I had this set of contacts I'd made around the world from Russian intelligence and British intelligence and Taliban guys, all these weird contacts, and I had this amazing phone book of just dudes I could call. And I was like, well, I'm doing nothing.
What can I use it for? Yeah.
What can I use it for? So we kind of did this show, and the first episode we were talking about Afghanistan. And I was sitting there with a guy who works for the White House, and being able to just like ask him the question and not be like, well, I don't have investors in this thing. Like I can ask that question, like, if we kill all the leadership, will that solve the problem? The answer is no, but I can ask that question because it's kind of, I'm not beholden to anyone at this point. So that was why we did the show, is kind of, bring light to these countries like Kyrgyzstan and Afghanistan, who we don't think about at all. It just never gets reported because it's such a deep thing to try and get. To understand some of these topics, we do like an hour and a half piece, because it takes an hour and a half to understand the complexity of their relationship between Beijing and Moscow.
Sure. Perfect, man. That's, that sort of blows my mind, because you think about these sort of topics that like the BBC would speak about, but there's of course certain things that you would speak about that they would never, ever, ever dream of publicizing whatsoever. So that's really cool that you're essentially like an exclusive in between the scenes. The next question I wanted to ask you is, obviously going into the whole digital space, running like a podcast, what are a few apps that you use on like a day-to-day basis while creating these podcasts, or just genuinely marketing the podcast as well?
So Twitter's obviously very important for the kind of show we are. I use Libsyn mostly to host my show. They're pretty good. Instagram, I use a bit, but not too much. Twitter is my main one. I use Signal a lot because that's encrypted chat. And a lot of the time, when you get a guy from the White House, he wants to make sure this entire conversation is encrypted. And a lot of these conversations you have, 40 minutes to chat with them about, let's say, private military is operating in Chad.
Sure.
And then that 40 minutes, it's on the record. And that 20 minutes afterwards is, okay, here's what's actually happening. This is what's going on. There's a lot of stuff you have to leave out for classification reasons.
Sure.
But like generally those apps, Facebook's kind of it, but generally like our traffic is mostly through Twitter and just people listening to the show through Spotify and all the other ones. It's Reddit as well. Reddit's pretty good for that as well. Reddit seems to bounce around stuff, but obviously there's a lot of crazy people on Reddit too.
Oh yeah, definitely. I've got mixed opinions with Reddit. So So what you're basically telling me as well, from like an outsider's point of view, is I can't remember how many streams you said, but it's quite a significant amount, right? And that's all organic, basically?
Pretty much. That's mostly all organic. we're just cracked 130,000 streams, and we go up each month, which is great. But yeah, again, we haven't paid for any advertising on this thing. We haven't really driven it out yet. It's literally just me and another dude working on the show. I work on it sort of a couple of days a week. He works at, just kind of comes in and out. But generally, it's just been organic. It's just been picking the right stories, chatting to the right people. And obviously, when guests come on, they tend to tweet about they've just been on the episode. When you get a guy who's the US envoy to Libya, and he's like, hey, I was on this Redline program. It was a really good piece. You should watch it. Obviously, a lot of people tune in, but it is a really weird niche. Like it's
definitely
not a lot of people would really get into the show. It's very kind of.
I think it's one of those as well. Like I think a lot of people would be into it, invested into it, but it's not necessarily something that someone gets their phone and searches for. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's also why it's so unique on both the sides of the spectrum, because one, like no one's going to really typically get out their phone and search for it if they're not already like a weekly listener. But two, if someone sees it and obviously they're not searching for it, they're like, well, that sounds interesting. So yeah, that's pretty cool.
But it's a weird kind of feel, because frankly, not the general public usually is interested in the geopolitics of Kyrgyzstan. But I know, for instance, I had a colonel from NORAD, who's the guys in charge of the nukes. He got in contact with me and was like, I'm a fan of the show. A lot of people at NORAD, the missile guys, listen to the show. I know I had a government minister from Australia come down and meet me and went, yeah, I love the show. I'm like, so it's this weird kind of anyone who's really into the show is usually policy nerds. So 9 times out of 10, when I get emails from people saying, love the show, thanks so much, great piece on whatever I was doing at the time, it's usually some senator or some policy guy or some missile expert or just someone who's already kind of in that weird niche. So I'm now just got this, again, weird phone book of people that are probably going to get me arrested at some point.
Yeah, definitely. So with that being said, in terms of the audience and the sort of how niche down this concept is, what's one of the weirdest stories you've sort of heard from either one of the guests or one of the listeners that commenting and reaching out to you, etc.?
So obviously there's some interesting kind of random people, but the best one I saw is I when it goes up on Reddit, I usually don't look too much at the comments, if it's me posting in particular. But I remember someone posted our article we did on, I think it was Libya, I can't remember. And the comments were like, yeah, he works for the CIA. I've seen this guy. He's funded by Langley as a team of staff. They paid $500,000 to work for the US government. And I just kind of went, I wish, man. Yeah. I don't usually respond to Reddit stuff, but that one I did. I was like, I'm the host of the show. No, I'm an Australian guy wearing a cardigan sitting in Perth. It's not particularly that special.
But as well, what do your family and friends think about it as well? Because obviously, that's your, like you said, you come from a job, so it's not like you was working in what they got at Woolworths, for example, and then you're like, yeah, I'm starting this podcast, blah blah. But you must get some strange reactions when you sort of say to your everyday friends, oh, I interviewed this guy from some crazy country.
It's particularly weird. It's a running joke for my friends and friends and family that, if Marco's going to get killed, the guys at my office, whenever I go travel to a war zone, there's a poll going around whether I'll live or not. And my poor girlfriend, I bless her heart, she comes on quite a lot of these trips with me. Mm-hmm. And the amount of times we're sitting in a bar and a very obvious intelligence officer will come up and say hi. We've had Egyptian intelligence, we've had Russian intelligence, we've had Romanian intelligence. Who'll come sit at the bar and be like, so what do you do for work? Please tell me what you do for work. And ask lots of questions about, dam projects in Ethiopia of me. And it's like, my girlfriend just rolls her eyes like, fuck, even I can pick this guy. What the hell is
Oh my God. That's crazy. So the next question I wanted to really ask you is, obviously from an outside point of view, you sound very sort of business mindset, entrepreneurial for you to go ahead and start this podcast. Is there a book that you would recommend, one book you would recommend to someone that sort of jumped on this podcast? They've sort of realized that me and you obviously run our own podcast and think, okay, something that I want to pursue moving forward. I'd like to create my own podcast. Where would you sort of land them with that sort of being said? Not necessarily around podcasts like a book, but maybe the mindset that sort of helped you get to where you are as well.
There's so many books. I mean, I'm always buried in a gazillion books about random subjects. I think if you're starting a podcast, you want to really know your niche. Like I particularly, when I go do a show, I have a kind of rule that I really want to know about 90% of what my guest is going to say anyway, because I can then lead into the conversation. So if I'm asking questions, who's likely to win the Civil War, I kind of already know what the outcome's going to be before I ask it. If you're going to start a podcast, pick a niche or pick a topic or a theme and really study that theme so you come across as intelligent. Because I know that, like, I've listened to other geopolitical podcasts, it's great, but like I listened to one from another guy who I like his show, but like you do an episode on something like West Papua and he call them Papuans, and it's like, okay, so you obviously haven't read too much about it, because it immediately clicked me as soon as he went, it's a West Papua. It's like, okay, you haven't read, you kind of got a grasp, but not really. So yeah, that if you're going to read that, I'd say that's a good place to start, is really know your niche and know your subject. For you. If you're going to do a horror podcast, maybe get a bunch of really good horror stories under your belt, so when you get into an interview, you can chat about 3 or 4 things rather than just sticking on that 10% of knowledge, because that's what people will come for. Is if you're an expert and you're listening, they're going to expect you to be one.
For sure, yeah. And obviously, if I think personally, obviously, if you are running a podcast, then you do need to be that authority figure that is essentially putting those questions out for the guests as well, because ultimately they're going to come for the guests, but they're also going to come for the person that's leading the podcast, right? So that's really cool.
Yeah.
What sort of tips would you have for a newbie in terms of social media? I know you said you use a couple, you use Instagram and Facebook not as much. I know you let the podcast do the speaking, but, obviously me and you met each other through Facebook. So I know that you obviously do certain things throughout Facebook. What does your typical day-to-day look like in terms of outreach or anything? Are you reaching out to these people? I doubt Central Intelligence you're reaching out through Facebook, right? But
no.
What does it sort of look like? I'm guessing, are you getting like people coming in for these podcasts, or are you sort of reaching out to them? What does that whole concept look like for you?
So usually I do everything remote. We use a great program called Source Connect, which effectively allows us to chat in full HD. Like effectively, that's great. It's a great way to record the conversation. It sounds like we're in the room together, but obviously most of my guests are, in the episode we just did, one was in London, one was in Washington, and one was in Nigeria. It's like, well, it's very hard. I don't want to fly between all those places. I go on, if you're going to start a podcast, there's a bunch of really friendly podcast groups. Go in there, ask questions. Everyone there is starting their own show, and most people are really willing to help. They really sit down and go, actually, you probably want to make sure you've got a good mic, or make sure you get a pop filter. Little hints and tricks that, when I have a degree in audio production, and that was my very first thing I did. But a lot of people don't, and there's always friendly people there willing to answer any questions. And just reach out to people. I mean, 9 times out of 10, we've got, the ambassador for some country, because I knew some guy I met in a bar when I was in, Turkey who contacted, because I know that he's good friends with the ambassador's chief of staff, and it kind of goes like that. So Facebook and connecting, call on your friends and favors to go, hey man, like, how you been? We met in that bar in Istanbul a year ago. How you been? I know, are you still working for the State Department? Oh, sweet, man. I'm trying to get into with the ambassador to, Kenya, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And he'll go, yeah, actually, I know his chief of staff. Here's his email. Go ahead.
And that's sort of like your typical process, right?
So yeah, most of my process is sometimes people come to me. They'll go, hey, I'm a fan of the show. I'm chief of staff for this person. But generally, I kind of make a list, when we do a piece. So we're just about to do a piece on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which is in Armenia, Azerbaijan. And I made a list of like the 10 people I'd really, really want for the show. And then I kind of went through my top 3 and sent them emails, or sent them, went through my little friends list and went, okay, well, I know he works at Carnegie, and I know a research assistant who works at Carnegie who could probably put me in touch with him. And that's how it goes from there. And that's how we get contacts. But generally, everyone's friends here. Everyone's usually willing to help. And it's, if you pick your right niche, I mean, if you're doing a horror podcast, most horror people want to come on shows. If you pick celebrity gossip, they've got a gazillion shows already. They're not going to be as willing to do it. So it depends how big you are and obviously what your games are.
Exactly. Yeah. Cool. Perfect. So how long has the podcast been live for at this moment in time?
This would be next week will be episode, I'm just looking at my little board here, episode 15. So we've been going for 5 months. So it's all fairly new. Like, again, we did not expect this to take off. You know, when we launched, we were like, okay, well, we're going to get like 10 streams and you know, it'll be like 20 episodes or a year before we crack that kind of 1,000 mark. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, we cracked the 1,000 mark really quickly. And then it's just been kind of doing this since. So yeah, I mean, so far the feedback's been all good. Apart from, obviously, you always get a few nut jobs. I always get a few weird emails. About one hate mail a week of, really? You know, like, it's always the weird, like, no, the American missiles are better than the Russian ones. You don't know what you're talking about. Come talk to me. You come over here, I'll bash your face in if you talk shit about American missiles again.
That's what I mean. You must get some mental stuff coming through to you, the topics you're speaking about. Wow, that's wicked. Oh. I'm very, very pleased with the growth you've had with the podcast so far. Where are you?
And your show seems to be going as well. You're looking like you're just sitting at 800 subscribers, which is awesome. It's a great mark to hit.
Yeah. So it's great. Obviously, this is just like a little segment of my channel. So it's great to have people on, and just I literally love people doing their own thing. So the show is literally called Design a Future. That's why I reached out to you, because you know you're obviously designing a future. What I like to say, you're going above your means to sort of create this show that's obviously doing so well so far. But where do you sort of see this going? Obviously, you obviously started this podcast. It's doing really well so far. Is there like a certain number that you're sort of reaching for, or a certain guest that you're sort of striving to get onto the show? You know, what does this podcast look like in a year's time?
Well, the podcast is you know, it kind of started as a pet project, so we didn't really have a big goal. I mean, obviously the goal now is probably hit 1 million streams, which I think by our math we should hit somewhere around December if the math holds. But you know, it's very early days at the moment. But I guess it's just getting bigger and bigger guests. I mean, we'd obviously love to meet, you know, the president of some country would be awesome. But generally, I think breaking bigger stories. I mean, frankly, we're starting to get to the point now where there's one story we've been working on for a little while about a country, and I won't say anything yet, obviously, because it's not out and it's all hush-hush at the moment. But I'm working with a couple of journalists from the New York Times and the Daily Beast, and we're all collaborating because now, for some reason, I'm in that circle of people who
that's amazing.
Just collaborating with. But yeah, if the story breaks, we'll effectively be at the forefront of a international, very, very big story, which is shocking. We had no idea that, you know, we would get included in that. It was just sort of a friend of a friend who worked for the newspaper was like, no, we got to get this guy. He runs a show. It's really good. He, you know, reads a lot of policy, writes a lot of stuff. He'd be the great guy to chuck in this kind of WhatsApp group of what the story is. And that's mind-boggling already. So I guess breaking big stories is the next step for us.
Wicked, yeah. And I think that's such an interesting concept as well, is because you're actually like out in the trenches putting together this actual piece of content that you're actually going to dissect throughout your podcast, rather than like me personally, like I've only done a little bit of research into who you are and you know what you do, rather than you have to actually have like some serious facts to go into a session like that, right?
Oh, so much. Like we do, I do nothing but reading books. Like the amount of times I'll have dinner with my girlfriend, I'll be like eating it over a map of some like Soviet country, being like, well, obviously we got to understand the railways that go through here. But at this point, you know, my poor girlfriend has to hear me like, you know, there's crazy people rooms. We have all the newspapers everywhere. It's like, well, obviously the president here is connected with the chief of the army, and the army's done this. Like, I'm very quickly becoming that guy, which is very sad for me. But yeah.
What does your girlfriend think of it all?
Oh, that poor woman. She's very supportive of the show. She's absolutely lovely. She's generally interested in this. You know, she's traveled to enough war zones with me now that she's kind of interested in it as well. Because you don't meet with another. Once you meet a few arms dealers and a few guys like that, you're like, oh, this is a super weird and interesting world. But generally, she just smiles and nods. I mean, she's very busy. She's a psychiatrist as well, and I work for the Red Cross, so she's very busy with that sort of stuff as well. So the two of us are constantly, I'll come home from work and be like, did you see the press conference from Argentina today? Like, it's a very weird relationship.
Yeah, it might be lucky that she's a psychiatrist as well.
Oh, I think I'm very lucky. I think, yeah. There's not many people. I remember if I could sum up my girlfriend in one piece, it would be, we were booking this trip to Transnistria, this war zone, and I found this hotel there, and I was looking around and I was like, well, there's bullet holes in the wall, and that's not great. And she went, these carpets don't match the curtains. It's pretty gross. Like that's I guess that's the best summary I can give.
That's what she went for.
Yeah, ignored the giant picture of Lenin across the bed. Just, as long as the carpets and the throw pillows match, she was pretty happy.
Oh, that's so funny, man. Well, wicked, man. It's been a pleasure to have you on. I wish you all the best with the podcast. Where can I actually find the podcast for anyone watching?
So you can just type in the Redline on Spotify or Apple or Google or pretty much all the major platforms we're on. We are getting our stuff slowly on YouTube, but we haven't really been pushing that because it's an audio-only podcast this time. Yeah. But yeah, generally if you type in the Redline and it's a big red thing with planes on it, and generally you get to hear my voice sounding very depressing for an hour and a half.
Well, I tell you what I would love to see on YouTube is like a day in the life of Michael at this point. I want to see from interviewing this colonel to then researching 100 newspapers. Sounds a bit hectic to me.
It's at this point, it's just caffeine and gaff tape. That's the only thing holding my life together at the moment. But
I think that's it for most of us, man.
Yeah, no, my life is you think it'd be very exciting, but it's mostly very very boring. So yeah.
Oh, wicked. Well, thanks again, Michael. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for the guys watching and listening at home, and we'll see you in the next episode. Hollywood 6.